Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you very much. Brilliant, so we'll just give one more minute just for people to join, 30 seconds, and then we'll get going. Okay, so we'll get going. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Stevenson, Training Quality Assurance Specialist at Network Rail. I've just got my video on just for this quick moment, just so you can put a face to a name. But I will, just now you've seen my face, I am just going to take it off video, just so we can make sure that the bandwidth remains okay. But thank you everyone for joining us today. The focus of today is going through the new release of the RTAS Rules version 2 and what has changed. I'm joined by a number of representatives from NSAR who've also helped co-publish and produce these rules, version 2.0. The reason why this publication is titled A Collaborative Approach by NSAR, Network Rail and the rail industry is because the majority of the changes to the rules are based on feedback that you've kindly provided over the last few years. And just so we can manage everyone's expectation, the presentation itself shall take roughly between 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll hand over to Q&A questions, some of them that have already kindly been submitted beforehand. But also, if you do have any questions, which I'll just go through on the next section, please submit it in the chat function that is available. So you'll all remain muted just to avoid any background noise until the Q&A session at the end. As I said, please submit your questions via the chat function. We will plan to answer all questions today, but unfortunately, if there's any circumstances where we're unable to answer any of the questions, we will answer them individually via the TQAS mailbox. I anticipate we'll have a number of questions, and they'll be run across both webinars. But as I said, if there isn't any questions that are unable to be answered, they will be answered for you after September 21st, which is our final webinar slot. So first of all, I'd just like to say a huge thank you to you all for not just attending today, but ensuring that we maintain Network Rail's safety message and mantra, that is making sure that everybody goes home safely every day. The following agenda is as follows. So we're going to go through the publication and the requirements of RTAS version 2.0, what is new, what has changed, and the benefit of the changes, followed by a Q&A session at the end. So the publication and compliance requirements. So there's 4 areas as a result of the changes that we've made. So we've taken your thoughts and feedback has been gathered, as I said, over a number of years, but please continue to submit your improvements to the TQAS mailbox, which I will provide the actual email address at the end of this presentation. We've also tried to address the current requirements, but also the future requirements as well. And we've made some, even though we've had a small proportion of version 1 rules had become outdated, and we tried to reflect the current practices of the assurance program to make sure they're up to date and everyone's familiar with exactly what the requirements are. Point 3, lessons learned from reoccurring breaches. So this is mainly from a formal review panel context. As an assurance team, we've discussed the latest trends and how to address them as well, as I said, as well as the future trends as well. And increasing intelligence of bad practice from RTAS Rules version 1.0. So this is mainly from a data and intelligence perspective, which NSAR have gathered throughout their assurance visits. And NSAR will now start to share with you periodic assurance topic trends. So that's trends they pick up on their assurance visits, and they're trends that you'll be able to address as a collective. So there'll be a lot more live data for you to use to support you with your RTAS compliance. So the rules were published on August 24th, 2020. They were published on the NSAR website. They were made available by the Skills Backbone, and also we sent out some Sentinel comms as well. As you can see by NSAR's website, there's two versions which are available. The first version is the full version of the actual rules itself, and then the second version is the highlighted changes between RTAS Rules version 1 and version 2. The kind of changes are color coded, so it's important to remember that the blue changes are completely new clauses, yellow are altered clauses to version 1, and green are any clauses that have moved section. So say, for example, the RTAS RTAS assurance requirements were previously at the bottom of version 1, and now they're in section 2 of the rules. So they've been highlighted for you, so you can clearly see where there's been movers and shakers. Actually, it's section 3 that is the RTAS requirements. What's really important to remember is that, can you please familiarize yourself with the entire document, because as I said, there's been a few movers of clauses, and often it's been a move with regards to, it might have gone from point 23 to point 25. So it's imperative that you familiarize yourself with the entire document. And also what's quite important to remember is you'll be cascading all of those requirements down to your fellow peers. So please familiarize yourself with as much of the document as possible. There's a 3 months compliance date because of the sheer volume of changes, but this should give you plenty of time to address those changes to your policies, procedures, and your QIP. There'll be no grace period granted. So the compliance date is it's not September, 24th of November, 2020. Angi, could you please give us a little bit of a feel about what sort of expectations you'll be having prior to the compliance period?
Yes, Alex. So we'll be looking for everybody to start working towards those rules, version 2, now that they have been published. So the compliance period is still a long way off, but we would be looking on assurance visits and then conversations that you have with your quality assurance managers to be understanding what new or changed requirements there are, and making improvements or additions or changes to your policies and procedures so that you're ready for the 24th, so that when that date comes, you're already there.
Thank you, Angi. So some of the general changes that have been made. So we've enforced or reformatted the document to reflect Network Rail kind of template, so to speak, to ensure that there is a consistency with other Network Rail documents, but also to reinforce everyone's understanding and address the confusion that these are Network Rail rules, and there is NSAR, the appointed assurance organisation, to carry out those rules on our behalf. But what is important to remember also is we work very closely with one another to ensure collaboration and to make sure that the compliance level is what is expected within the rail industry. We also have regrouping of the requirements after there's been altered to a number of the clauses itself. So please reinforce and make sure you're familiar with all the movers and changes compared to version 1. As I said, it's highlighted in green, but not all the changes are identified, because as I said, some of them have moved from one small 0.23 to 24. So there's been a full legal review of the requirements to ensure there's consistency and fairness. So that full legal review has been put in place to ensure that we remain compliant, but at the same time, they've removed some of the legal jargon to make sure that the rules are easy to understand and implemented by all. But for legal purposes, there has been a few legal terminology included that just needed to stay in. There's been an increase in detail to the clauses, just so that we can support you with the actual requirements. There's no hidden clauses. You know exactly what you need to comply with. And then there's been that kind of moves on to the next section, really, about increasing of transparency to make sure that you are aware of exactly what those requirements are, who needs to comply with those particular requirements, and ensuring that there is that degree of fairness and understanding by all that these are exactly the requirements you need to adhere to. There's greater alignment between the Sentinel scheme rules and RTAS to make sure that they are applicable. And there's also now referencing to NSAR's skills backbone, because obviously that's where all the document control is done, uploaded and managed as well. So briefly going through some of the new changes. So we focus now on completely new clauses that have gone into the RTAS rules version 2.0. As you can see by page 5, all of the improvements and future enhancements will be reviewed and approved by a set cohort of key stakeholders. This will also include any future publications or dispensations that shall be granted. There's been an improvement around an enhancement around sponsoring for the purposes of training only. So this continues to be a serious concern, as individuals need to be ensured that they will also be put to work as well. And if there is any evidence to support sponsoring for the purposes of training only, it could potentially warrant a formal review panel investigation. Section 2 focuses on the CTM 202 requirements. So they're no longer, when you're delivering RTAS assured training, no longer do you need to adhere to the CTM 202 requirements. They are now available in the RTAS rules in section 2, as it's stated there, just so that you are exactly sure of what you need to adhere to from those particular requirements. Previously, you needed to go between both documents. So now they are clear, easy to understand what the CTM 202 clauses are. But the CTM 202 standard is still applicable if you are delivering courses outside of that RTAS scope. But it's just important to remember that new inclusion has been put in place for you. Now I'll hand you over to Angi to go through the next section.
Thanks, Alex. So section 3 has had new restrictions on parties suspended or proven to be involved in the RTAS rules breaches of the RTAS rules. Under RTAS v2, any parties that are suspended or proven to be involved in breaches won't be able to hold any future position of influence, and any involvement in planning, facilitation and delivery of training of an assured provider without the specific approval of Network Rail. We formalised the requirements of audits of the assurance management organisations, management systems and practices, and these happen by Network Rail. Section 4, we've improved the wording of existing requirements with the inclusion of a new dispensation opportunity. So we've strengthened the wording by removing any ambiguity that there was within clauses about the delivery of training by assured positions, the use of and delivery to specific toolkit materials requirements. Exceeding delegate numbers has been prohibited under any circumstances, and any intended reduction to durations of training require a formal dispensation from Network Rail, and NSAR will facilitate that discussion. And the retention of those dispensations needs to be held within the applicable course pack. What that means is that for courses such as on-track plan that have many combinations of modules, standalone modules within them, sometimes there's duplicate content, and when you put them all together in one package of training for machine controllers and crane controllers, then there's elements of duplication that can be removed, and that can sometimes lead to an overall shortening of the duration as they would have been if they were standalone modules. So if you have a specific proposal on delivering combinations of modules that would actually affect the overall duration, that's what we're referring to here, and it needs a formal dispensation from Network Rail. We have new requirements in section 4 on returning to delivery after absence. So any trainer or assessor returning to delivery after absence needs to be notified to NSAR, and mentoring arrangements need to be considered. The circumstances that RTAS V2 asks that this happens is whether they've been absent for a period of time exceeding 6 months, or they've had significantly reduced delivery over time exceeding 6 months, and there have been changes to the training or assessment material and or standards that have taken place during that period of absence. It's important to note though that these are just minimum requirements that RTAS presents to you. The best practice would drive this to be done in most circumstances where someone's been absent or have had significantly reduced delivery. So while RTAS V2 mandates that it has to happen when training and assessment changes have happened, we would be looking for all providers to work for best practice. And when someone's been absent or reduced delivery, you consider if they need additional support and additional mentoring to help them get comfortable again with what they're delivering. Formalisation of dispensation for facilities has also been introduced, where the demand for workplace assessments makes compliance to completing the 6 per 12 months period not possible. What that means is where there is a reduced opportunity to be able to do 6 workplace assessments within a 12-month period as mandated in RTAS V2, there is the facility to have a dispensation against those requirements. That's written into the rules now, and that would be facilitated between yourself as assured providers and by NSAR. Section 5 has had improved details of the premises requirements for delivering of training, excluding where NSAR approved site is required, such as DCCR, AOD, electrification, distribution, etc. So where those courses or assessments require practical facilities, although they don't need NSAR approval to be able to deliver those courses on the practical facilities, we would expect that risk assessments are done to make sure that those sites are fit for purpose from both a learner experience and health and safety, that they meet the mandated lesson plan specifications, and of course that the site owning provider is not suspended. We've increased upskilling requirements within RTAS V2. The timescales remain unchanged from RTAS V1, so the 2 observations within 3 months with a potential extension to 6 months is still the case in RTAS V2. RTAS V2 formalises the requirement for first-time trainer observations, and whilst first-time assessor observations aren't included within the RTAS rules, NSAR is currently operating this arrangement for first-time assessors where the individual is not already a trainer. We've made it explicit in version 2 of the RTAS rules that the mentor must be physically present during mentored events. We've also specified the suitability of a mentor. So in front of you, you can see that for somebody to be a mentor to another individual, that individual has to hold the capability for a minimum of 12 months, has delivered the competence themselves a minimum of 4 times over the previous 12 months, and that they haven't been involved in any incident, accident, close call, formal review by sponsor or RTAS, and any investigation involving the competence being mentored in previous 12 months. We've brought in the improved training and assessment record retention changes, which was a large volume of feedback that we were receiving, which is where somebody is an employee of that provider and is attending the competence and training department that's an assured provider. Because that individual is an employee, booking forms aren't required, joining instructions aren't required, and a copy of ID and permission, of course, to copy the ID is also not required at the training event. This is because most bookings are either done through internal systems or through rostering arrangements, and internal systems usually cover the same information giving that happens in booking forms and joining instructions. It's just done in a different way because the individual attending the training is an employee. It is clear to note though that where that organisation is a sub-sponsor of the individual, the permission to attend the event from the primary sponsor is still a requirement. We formalised requirements to retain practical site safety briefing records for events such as DCCR, AOD, electrification, distribution, etc. Again, wherever there is a practical training event that requires a layout to be able to deliver that training, then we are looking for site safety briefings to be recorded and retained within the course packs.
Thank you, Angie. So the section 5 focuses on data corrections. Now, this has been enhanced because of two main reasons. Number one is the amount and volume of requests that have come through from individual providers. And number two, the amount of time between delivery and the actual request for the data correction. We've actually seen some, and when I say we, Network Rail has seen some requests that have been over 2,000 days old from the initial point of delivery. So everyone is aware, very soon, Network Rail will have a process where data corrections over 21 days will be reviewed by Network Rail before they are approved and could be subject to formal review. So moving on to Appendix 1, the formal review procedures. So this is a completely new section that contains increased detail around the requirements from a formal review context. So position 1 in terms of the reporting of an alleged or suspected breaches, all the avenues where you can report an allegation are now clearly defined. The only way that you can remain anonymous is via Cirrus. But one thing that's important to remember is when you use Cirrus, it can be a very lengthy process when you initially report the allegation through to the formal review. But what's also, you could use the formal review panel, the formal review mailbox, which NSAR have as well, which is a bit more speedier, so to speak. But the thing that I really want to stress is the only way to stay exactly anonymized is via the Cirrus system. Point 2, the conduct of formal reviews. So the entire formal review process is now clearly defined. Who is involved? It includes the timescales for both the providers, individuals, NSAR, and Network Rail. Point 3, so suspensions. This is a really, really big topic. It has removed the timescale associated with a permanent ban. If you review RTAS Rules version 1.0, a permanent ban could potentially be applied if 2 breaches were occurred within a 3-year period. But we are now starting to evaluate formal reviews depending on how serious they are and the impact that has on the Network Rail managed infrastructure. So what's really important to remember here is that if you are subject to a formal review, a permanent ban could be applied if you've breached the rules in any time scale. So to make that clearer for you, in version 1, it said that if you breached the rules in 2016, for example, and you had a 4-year suspension applied for that, you then came back into the assurance scheme in 2021 after you finished your suspension, and you straight away did another breach that resulted in a 3-year suspension. In accordance to version 1, a permanent ban could not be applied. Now, there is no timescale associated with a permanent ban. It is when you have breached when you've breached the RTAS rules, on 2 occasions, Network Rail and the formal review panel will consider whether a permanent ban is applicable. And with part 4, the conduct of the formal review panel appeals and hearings, that is clearly defined like the conduct of the formal review. So you can clearly see who is applicable for what again, the responsibilities and information that needs to be submitted during the appeal and hearings, and who is held to account within that particular scenario and context. One point I'd like to bring back on to point 3 This does not include temporary suspensions as well, unless they are unfounded. Please familiarise yourself with all the requirements in Appendix 2. So if you are ever in that situation, you would know exactly what your roles and responsibilities are within that context. Appendix 2, so the Assured Provider Records Transferral Procedure. So this is applicable in case someone unfortunately decides to leave the RTAS scheme. You'll need to adhere to the requirements stipulated within this document. I will not go into a lot of detail with regards to what is defined within this document, but please familiarise yourself with those requirements if you do unfortunately decide to leave the RTAS assurance scheme. There's been 4 new breaches added to the RTAS Rules version 2.0. This reflects the current circumstances that we face, and considering the number of years that these rules have been in place for, it's been updated to reflect, as I said, the current requirements. These could be changed and updated on a regular basis because of the environment that we face. I'd also like to emphasise that all the other breaches are equally as important. So please make sure that you familiarise yourself with those as well. We're going to go through the changes now. So that's highlighted in yellow. So the changes to version 2 compared to version 1. And I hand over to Angi again just to go through some of those for you.
Okay, so we're going down to a greater level of detail now, which is effectively what were existing clauses that have either had updates made to them or they might have been increased. So following on from what Alex said earlier about the sponsorship of trainers, we have made it clearer within RTAS V2 that trainers and assessors must be sponsored by the provider that they are delivering for, and all trainers and assessors' primary sponsor must be an assured provider. We've increased the clarity on assurance visit action plans and timescales within the document. So RTAS V2 tells you in detail what the submission timescales of action plans to providers from NSAR is. It tells you the actions that we go through in timescales, what actions the provider needs to do, what target dates are set, and what the process is for submission and review of action plan evidence from providers to NSAR and vice versa. We've increased the guidance on deviation from training course durations. Both of these are to be documented and retained. There is a move in training toolkit materials to include instructions of what and how you can reduce durations within the training materials. However, we're still in very early days on that. So what we have done is said that where there isn't any instructions within the training materials, RTAS V1, the risk assessment requirements are unchanged. And again, both need to be documented and retained within your course packs. We've increased the guidance on trainer and assessor observations in the same vein as what we have for mentors. So, in perfect English, if you're observing or being observed, you must be with the trainer or the assessor that you're observing, and trainers and assessors, your observer, should be present with you to do a direct observation. We've got new requirements for trainer and assessor observations. So formal observations are to be direct, as I said in the previous slide, and assured providers that sub-sponsor trainers and assessors are now also required to conduct observations. Those observations on our percentage sample relevant to the volume of training that trainer or assessor does for you. But if it's a small amount of delivery that sub-sponsor trainer and assessor does for you, the minimum requirement is for 1 observation per discipline, so 1 training and 1 assessment. The actual observation volumes themselves that are contained in RTAS V1 haven't changed. We've improved the detail regarding the desponsoring of assured trainers and assessors. No action can be taken until NSAR has communicated whether there is a reason that that individual cannot be desponsored by the provider, similar to what we have now, but slightly stronger. We've increased the wording of existing requirements covering online exams. We were aware that this is one of the assurance processes that is most often misunderstood by trainers and assessors and providers. So we've provided a lot more detail on trainer exams and online exams and how they apply to operational and non-operational trainers. So as a summary, non-operational trainers, you do your online exams every 12 months before the competence expires, and operational trainers, interim assessments before the online exam can be taken. That hasn't changed. The online exams can still be taken when a temporary suspension pending a conclusion of a formal review is underway. But the removal of the opportunity to renew competence by online exams has been removed if you are suspended as a result of an RTAS outcome of a formal review.
So there's been some strengthening on the command of English language capabilities, clause 5.11.2, footnote 19. So now we focus on including candidates in this aspect as well, because previously it was just delegates. But what's also really important to remember is that it's not just PTS training this is applicable to. It is now applicable to all forms of courses that you deliver. Ultimately, the responsibility sits with the sponsor, but the training and assessment providers are the gatekeepers of those individuals who access the infrastructure. This is usually judged in a lot of contexts on whether an individual can deliver an emergency call or not, but we should also be looking at other ways we can establish whether the delegate or candidate has effective command of the English language through delivery techniques or the way they kind of talk, introduce themselves. The icebreaker is usually an indication as well. What I'd also like to emphasize as well, you'll have Network Rail's full backing if there is any question around discrimination, etc., from the individual or sponsor. This will be a topic that is a real topic that will be considered in the future, and a lot's being done at the moment to see how we also can address this as well. Safe Work Pack retention requirements, clause 513.10. So for a PTS track induction training, you must retain the Safe Work Pack within the course pack. When you're delivering any other training and assessment, it can be an extract, and the requirements are from 1 to 3, as you can just see there. The flowcharts have all been updated from 7.1 to 7.6 to reflect the current requirements that NSAR and both Network Rail have. But what's really important is it's also enforced in the main body as well. So you can clearly see the timescales are the same. The requirements are both within a visual aid in terms of the actual diagrams, but also enforced in the main body as well. So please familiarize yourself with all the requirements in those flowcharts, which clearly define all your roles and responsibilities within a particular context. So the formal review outcome guidelines. So there's been an addition to the suspension duration to include beyond 5 years. In version 1, it was either 5-year suspension or a permanent ban could be applied where necessary. But now there is also a 5+ years inclusion within the formal review outcome guidelines. The permanent ban criteria has now changed to include deliberate, reckless contravention and contravention for personal benefit. Previously, it was sabotage or malicious intention. The negligence category has also changed and been updated to include potential to lead to loss or injury. The permanent ban, for everyone's understanding, has actually been applied already, and you will actually receive further communications about that in the near future. Additionally, suspensions can now be applicable to all those who have a direct input in the RTAS assurance scheme. I cannot stress that enough because it is a very different change between version 1 and version 2. So this now includes directors, training managers, planners, are referred to as guide in mind in this document. So please be mindful that we are now considering where the actual breach has occurred, because previously it was only holding trainers and assessors to account, but now it is everyone within the assurance context can have a suspension applied if they are found contributing to the breach of the RTAS rules. So some of the benefits of the RTAS rules version 2.0. So the first one is a plain English review. As I said, it's easier to understand, implement, and pass on the requirements to your peers, which is really important, that it's easy to understand and applicable to all. The rules have been written by the industry for the industry. We've taken numbers, a large proportion of your feedback over the years, but please continue to provide us with that feedback. As I said, I will provide you with the email address, the TQAS email address at the end of the call, so everyone knows where they can put their improvements and enhancements, because this will be reviewed and updated on a regular basis, because we'd like to make as many as many improvements as possible based on the recommendations that you kindly provide. So the quality of training and assessment has drastically now increased. So we can benchmark quality, and it's taken in a serious context in terms of performance as well. So these rules are far more rigorous and focusing on quality than they ever have done before. So it's really important that, as I said, you familiarise yourself with all those requirements, but they should be easy and concise to understand. Number 4, the new rules allow Network Rail and NSAR to hold the accountable to account. So this, as I said to you, around the guide in mind aspect, and also those who've actually contributed to the breach of rules are now accountable for their actions. But what's also important to remember, and I'd like to bring to everyone's kind of forefront of their mind as well, is that we're also holding, Network Rail are holding NSAR to account in terms of their activities and as a assurance organisation, but also Network Rail are being held to account to make sure that both NSAR and Network Rail carry out their activities in accordance to the RTAS rules. If you are unclear of what those requirements were previously, we've really focused on that transparency aspect to ensure that you are completely aware of what your requirements are, and there is no hidden clauses, so you know exactly what you need to conform with and when and who is responsible for that. As I said, there's been drastic improvements to the flowcharts to make it easier for you to understand and follow. And finally, point 7, with any future changes, dispensations, questions will be more swiftly answered now because of the assured cohort of key stakeholders that we have in place to make sure that your answers can be answered, so your questions can be answered quickly and swiftly. So we'll now go on to the QA section. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen just so I can put up some of the questions that have been previously put to us. While I'm doing that, can you please just submit your questions via the chat function, and I'm just going to get up the other questions that we have around the RTAS rules. Bear with me a second. So just while I'm getting those questions up, as I said, if you could have any questions that you can come up with, we've got as much time as you would like. We've just gone through 40 minutes of the presentation, but we will make sure we give plenty of time to make sure that we'll answer any questions for you. So bear with me a moment. I'm just having a few issues with my computer. Angie, while I'm getting these questions up. Do you mind answering, or do you mind putting forward the questions that have just been put in the chat for me?
Apologies, it does help you if you unmute before you start talking. I am sorry. Okay, so one of the main questions that we've got initially is about the command of the English language and what the benchmark to measure that is. Steve Dixa has put forward that the measure of the emergency telephone call isn't necessarily the most reliable tool to be able to measure that. And I think that's why a great deal of attention's been put to that, Steve, in regards to a lot of providers believe that if they're making sure the emergency call is done properly, then that person has sufficient command of the English language. Unfortunately, we have had recent, issues where people has passed the emergency phone call and they've been deemed to have an appropriate level of English, but they haven't really. It's just the training provider has felt restricted in that what is the measure of doing that. So there's a great deal of work underway at the moment to be able to try and support training providers more in terms of what is an appropriate measure. Effectively, you're using your common sense. If somebody can do the emergency phone call, but you're still not sure, then if they can hold a conversation with you, and if they are able to communicate and understand quite easily questions that you are giving to them, and you're having a very good conversation, or you're having a reasonable conversation, then that is more of a measure of the English language than the emergency phone call. It's absolutely critical that they understand the instructions that are being given to them when they're on site. And I realise majority of the industry fully appreciate that. Alex, have you managed to get the questions that had come in advance?
Yes, I have. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So there was a question around the applicable forms of identification. So whether the UK trained driving license is applicable, and that's something we will have a look at and come back to you on whether that is applicable to anything there. And there's also been a question around practical sites in terms of if there is a suspension applied but the practical site isn't seen as the justifiable reason for the suspension, can it still be used? No, unfortunately not. So when a assured provider is suspended, their practical site will also remain suspended as well. There's also been a few questions around mentorship aspects. So one of the mentorship questions was with regards to, well, what if it isn't applicable that you can deliver the competence 4 times in 12 months? Something I'd like to stress is there are courses which are infrequently delivered. So it will be on a case-by-case basis when it's that particular scenario. So please continue if there is any issues that you have with meeting that particular clause, which is 5.6.7, please let NSAR know and we'll follow the agreed process for you. There's been another question around, in particular, the action plan section, clause 3.5.1. Why cannot the, well, so there's requirements for the assurance organisation to respond back in 10 days, but an assured provider to respond back within 5 days. Now, the reason being is the sheer volume of action plans that the QAM has to go through. So that is why there's plenty of time given around ensuring that there's 10 days to make sure that they're able to see that and to be able to give you an answer. But unfortunately, that because of the sheer volume, it needs to be 10 working days around that particular aspect as well. There's been another question around whether, bear with me a second, whether there is training would be applicable for the for the assessment kind of criteria, which is clause 5.7.6. Unfortunately, it isn't. No, the workplace assessment is what is required within that particular aspect. Is there any other questions? Because any of the questions I have here, which we're unable to answer at this moment in time, I will answer after the final webinar on September 21st. But Angie, is there any more within the chat function at all to go through?
Yep, there is. We've got one question then on clause 2.2.1.1. Snappy, rolls off the tongue. That states that assessors must be operational. We have had a caveat previously that as long as we confirmed with the sponsor that the assessor would not take over the duties of the candidate, if they were found to not be competent, then the assessor could be non-operational. We haven't had a movement on that particular caveat. We will take that away to be able to discuss further with Network Rail as to whether the mandatory period of the RTAS rule removes the caveat or whether the caveat is still required. So please let us come back to you in writing on that one. The second question we have in just waiting there is a question from Mike Healy asking if we can use people who hold why can we not use people who hold competencies to help those undertaking a test as a verbal example, PTS? Admin team members often hold operational competencies themselves for personnel development, and this rule limits office staff development, or would mean not to provide a verbal. So I think, Mike, what you're asking is the rule is that you can't provide a reader or a scribe if that individual holds the competence. So basically the person isn't allowed to hold any competences. I can understand where you're coming from. Unfortunately, that particular clause will remain in place. I understand it can feel limiting, but actually what that is about is lots of historic incidents where trainers and assessors, administrators, trainer providers, etc. Had been found to actually be helping the individual through the assessment. And unfortunately, we still have to pay a little bit of a price for where things have been abused in the past, basically. So it's not a comfortable one, but it remains in place at the moment. And as Alex has said, we continue to review the requirements, and we've made it much easier and slicker to be able to take those reviews and republish. So if that does change in the future, then that should happen faster than this publication has actually happened. Another question from Steve Dixer. Steve, I think it would be sensible for observations number of events to be delivered to be prorated for 2020 due to lockdown. As there is there is a reduced opportunity due to the NR competence extensions. That is a question that's still under discussion, Steve. We obviously will be looking at the volumes of observations that have been done on a provider and provider case-by-case basis. I don't believe that we are looking at a blanket reduction at the moment, but there is obviously a sensible discussion that will happen during your quality assurance visits in terms of the number of opportunities that trainers and assessors have had to deliver, given that the lockdown is in place. So that will happen on one-to-one conversations within your assurance visits.
Angie, I'd like to build on that point, exactly what you're saying there around it will be discussed around your quality assurance visits with your QAM. But I'd also stress, everyone, it's actually important that those observations now happen, because as you can see by the mentorship requirements, some of you haven't delivered for 6 months, if not longer. So those observations are arguably more important than they ever have been before, because of the skills fade, because of some of the changes to the materials, etc. But that will be considered on an individual basis. So please be rest assured that that can be a discussion with your quality assurance manager. But please continue to address that as much as possible because of the skills gap and fade and material changes that we find. But also,
can I just add to that though, Alex?
Yeah,
we generally use other trainers and assessors to observe other trainers and assessors.
Mm-hmm.
So you're actually taking somebody out of delivery mode just to get just to get your numbers of assessments right. And I think we should be focusing on quality rather than quantity for this year, because by taking somebody out of training and assessment to go and observe another trainer assessor, I think everybody's noticing the burn now that we are getting busier. I acknowledge your point about skills fade and stuff like that, but the rule of thumb is we generally use another trainer assessor to observe each other.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think Steve, apologies for jumping in over you there, Alex, but from what we're seeing in terms of observations actually getting done now that people are back on a wide scale basis, is it's actually really busy. That people are taking full advantage to be able to get those observations done. And like I say, I completely agree with you that quality over quantity, but of course we can't make a blanket decision that the whole industry has to have a reduced requirement on that basis. So it will be a one-to-one conversation, and it will be a sensible discussion, and we are more than happy to work with each provider given the type of year that we've had, that obviously they are exceptional, but we prefer to have that conversation one-to-one rather than say there's a blanket dispensation.
Definitely, because everyone will be able to conform with different areas accordingly, and it is depending on your resource, etc. But Steve, we fully take on board what you're saying, and I remember the first time I joined Network Rail, and I spoke to the head of Network Rail training, and it's about now, hopefully you'll see with these rules, as I said, it's developed by the industry for the industry. We want to also make sure that you have an input here and are really valued in what you have to say. So what I'm trying to get at now is it's not so much necessarily about making sure that obviously all the rules are mandatory and need to be adhered to, but they will be discussed on an individual basis with this particular kind of requirement. Here is something that we'll discuss more in detail for you. So please bear with us, and any other things we'll communicate with you. But there also has been a question around conflict of interest, especially within a family-run business, because we appreciate a lot of you are also family-run as well. But I think what's really important to remember with the conflict of interest clause, that has been put in place because unfortunately historic investigations that have come into play, and legal have suggested that we need to remain that conflict of interest clause within the RTAS rules until there is a time where legal feel it's applicable to take it out, but that will remain in place until we review it at a later date. But is there any other questions from anyone?
There's one last question on the chat. I'm just mindful of our time. We've got about 6 minutes left. Question from Sylvia asking, how will we standardise the decisions made by each QAM regarding a dispensation? Can we be transparent so that each training provider is aware of some examples of what has been agreed, and you can anonymise the information? Sylvia, of course, we will look at giving you as much information as we possibly can. Standardisation is a regular practice within NSAR QAMs, just as much as we expect it from providers as well. So each assurance visit is discussed in terms of the content of its report, and of course, as that is quite a high topic of conversation during this programme's assurance visits, it is something that we will ensure is standardised across all QAMs. Of course, providing specific examples of when that's been done, we would have to take that away and have a look at what information we are able to provide you. Okay, I don't have any other questions coming into the chat. Alex, have you received any more?
I have done, but unfortunately my Word has crashed, so it's very hard for me. Technology at the moment isn't great at the moment. So there are some other outstanding questions that I will, if I do not answer them in the next webinar, we will address via the TQAS mailbox. And I'd just like, as I said I'd provide everyone with the email address for the TQAS. I'll just put it in the chat here for everyone, where all of the questions that remain unanswered, if they're not answered in the next webinar, we will make sure they're answered for you. But we just, you know, as a passing comment or as an ending comment for everyone, I really am appreciative of everyone's support in this. And please make sure you just, as I said, familiarize yourself with those requirements. Any questions, please notify NSAR. But otherwise, thank you for everyone's time today. And if you're not, I'd look forward to speaking to you on the next webinar. But otherwise, I hope you have a good rest of your day. And thank you for everyone's time.